Acute hemolytic transfusion reactions, sometimes abbreviated AHTR, are a type of reaction that can occur in response to a blood transfusion. Acute hemolytic transfusion reactions happen acutely, or quickly, during or after transfusion, manifesting with hemolysis, fever, flank pain, and hemodynamic instability. In this scene, I'll cover all the important details of AHTR. It's a warm day in Italy. The perfect day to make some homemade tomato sauce. You see, in Italy, I use fresh tomatoes and crush them into this pot to get sauce out of them. Coincidentally, my crushing tomatoes to make sauce is our anchor for acute hemolytic transfusion reactions, or AHTR. Let me explain. The breaking tomatoes represents hemolysis, since broken tomatoes look like a bunch of broken or hemolyzed RBCs, right? Next, check out the red sauce flowing through this clear tube at the bottom of my pot. Yep, this flowing red liquid kind of reminds me of blood transfusions. You know, since sauce traveling down the tube is like blood traveling into the patient, right? Putting this together, me breaking tomatoes to make flowing sauce is our anchor for acute hemolytic transfusion reactions. Acute hemolytic transfusion reactions are exactly what they sound like. A transfusion reaction characterized by the breaking or hemolysis of red blood cells shortly or acutely after a transfusion. Now that we have our anchor down, let's move on to discuss the cause of all this acute hemolysis. To keep things sanitary, I don't squeeze the tomatoes with my hands. No. I use these Y-shaped tongs to crush the tomatoes. By the way, you know what else is Y-shaped? You guessed it, antibodies. Therefore, these antibody-shaped tongs, crushing tomatoes, are here to represent antibodies targeting donor RBCs. Get it? My antibody-shaped tongs represent host antibodies, and the tomatoes being donated to the pot are the donor RBCs. My tongs are crushing the tomatoes, showing how host antibodies bind to and induce damage against donor RBCs. Host antibodies attacking RBCs leads to downstream complement activation, which we will discuss later in this scene. But before we discuss the clinical manifestations of AHTR, let's talk about why hosts develop antibodies against donor RBCs in the first place. Let's take a closer look at the jar connected to our sauce pot. Wait a second, that jar is meant for white sauce. Oh no, he's putting the wrong type of sauce in. This placement of the sauce in an incompatible jar is our symbol for ABO, blood type incompatibility. You know, since the wrong sauce, blood type, is going to the jar or the patient. Mismatched blood types is the most important cause of acute hemolytic transfusion reactions. You probably already know how this works, but let's review it for good measure. Recall that different people have different blood types, with RBCs expressing antigen A, antigen B, both, or neither. These correspond to the blood types A, B, AB, or O, respectively. Patients without antigens A or B in their blood will make antibodies against those antigens when they are exposed to blood that does have those antigens. For example, if a type O blood type person receives type A blood, he or she will develop anti-A antibodies. With these antibodies, if that patient gets transfused again with type A or AB blood, the anti-A antibodies will recognize the A antigen and bind to the blood. This eventually stimulates an immune attack against the donor blood, causing hemolysis. I also want to note that antibodies against minor blood antigens like rhesus, Duffy, Kell, and KID antigens can also cause acute hemolytic reactions. But these are far less important than ABO incompatibility. Just picture the red sauce going into the incompatible white sauce jar, and you'll be set to remember that ABO incompatibility is the most important cause of AHTR. Now that we've discussed why AHTR occurs, let's move on to the clinical presentation. See the fire underneath the pot? Who makes tomato sauce without cooking it first? Of course flames are involved. By the way, flames are our recurring symbol for inflammation. Get it? Flames for inflammation? Inflammation is an important part of the pathophysiology of acute hemolytic transfusion reaction, as the immune response against donor RBCs and resulting hemolysis creates a ton of systemic inflammation. Earlier, we discussed how antibodies target donor RBCs. Antibody binding to blood cells has several effects, one of which is activation of complement via the classical pathway. Complement activation ends in the formation of the membrane attack complex, which lyses the blood cells, but also produces inflammatory mediators like C3a and C5a along the way. These molecules are the major cause of the inflammation seen in AHTR. Ooh-wee. It's hot out here in the Italy sun. The flames nearby aren't helping either. Check out how I'm sweating gallons. This heat and sweating should remind you that fever is one of the other symptoms of acute hemolytic transfusion reactions. The antibody response to foreign blood cells and inflammation leads to a release of fever-inducing cytokines like IL-1 and IL-6. We have dedicated videos on those cytokines. You should check them out sometime. For now, just picture our sweaty chef next to the fire and you'll remember that fever is seen in AHTR. Here comes the kicker. Fever and inflammation are important clinical signs, but are not sufficient to get you a diagnosis of acute hemolytic transfusion reaction, since another type of transfusion reaction, febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, can also lead to fever and inflammation. So what's special about acute hemolytic reactions? Well, the short answer is hemolysis. You know, like the crushed tomatoes in my tongs. Hemolysis in acute hemolytic transfusion reactions happens by two mechanisms. First, complement activation against donor RBCs forms a membrane attack complex, which leads to intravascular hemolysis of RBCs. This literally forms a pore in the blood cell membrane, leading to cell death. The second mechanism of hemolysis is antibody-mediated opsonization of RBCs. Since antibody-bound cells are more likely to get eaten up by splenic macrophages. This mechanism results in extravascular hemolysis. All in all, hemolysis will happen, but test writers will usually not directly tell you that there is hemolysis happening. In fact, they won't give you a smear of broken RBCs, show you decreased haptoglobin, or even give you an increased LDH. So what will they give you? To answer, check out how my box of tomatoes fell off the table. Yeah, when I was squeezing these tomatoes, my back got a cramp, and I elbowed this box of tomatoes to the floor. Coincidentally, this unstable crate of tomatoes falling off the table is our symbol for hemodynamic instability, secondary to complement activation and hemolysis. Get it? The tomatoes were unstable on the table, representing hemodynamic instability, and they fell over, representing a crash of vitals seen in these patients. Hemodynamic instability primarily results from the complement anaphylatoxins C3a and C5a that we mentioned earlier. These are produced as byproducts to complement activation, which was triggered, remember, by host antibodies binding to donor RBCs. These anaphylatoxins and severe systemic inflammation caused by widespread hemolysis causes a crash in vital signs, with hypotension and tachycardia. We just covered a ton of detail, but the most important thing to remember is this. If the patient gets really sick a few hours after transfusion, like they are in shock with low blood pressure, high heart rate and stuff, you should think of acute hemolytic transfusion reaction. While febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reactions can cause inflammation, they do not cause shock or enough inflammation to cause patients to become unstable. I like to think of this difference as a result of hemolysis. In acute hemolytic reactions, you don't have enough red blood cells since they're all getting broken. As a result, you'll be pretty unstable, right? Lastly, let's return to me here. Yeah, I told you I got a back cramp while working so hard. See how I'm holding my lower back? This symbolizes the back or flank pain seen in AHTR. This pain is thought to arise from the toxicity of free hemoglobin released by the hemolysis of RBCs. This free hemoglobin travels to the kidney and retroperitoneal areas, causing damage and pain. Just imagine our chef here with his back pain, and you'll remember the flank or back pain in AHTR. Alright, that's it for acute hemolytic transfusion reaction. Let's summarize. Acute hemolytic transfusion reaction, or AHTR for short, is a transfusion reaction caused by host antibody-mediated destruction of donor RBCs. This occurs classically due to ABO blood type incompatibility. Host antibodies attacking donor RBCs results in complement activation, releasing anaphylatoxins and causing hemolysis. This explains the clinical manifestations of AHTR, which include inflammation, fever, hemolysis, hemodynamic instability, and flank pain. That's all for now. I think my hard-earned sauce is a pretty good batch. On to the next video.